education through the Orthodox Christian Network. This is also a ministry of the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm Michael Haldus, your facilitator, and I apologize. We're getting started a little bit late this Sunday. It's one of those Sundays where we have a good problem in church, big crowds, hectic, lots of good stuff going on, but the inevitable result is we get started late. But that's okay, because I know a lot of people watch these videos later, so that's fine too. So this Sunday, this is the fourth in a series of lessons we're doing this year, all about icons, Christ, and life. And this particular Sunday, we're focusing on what I'm calling icons, false images, and masks. I've prepared a lot of material. We'll see how much we get through, but whatever we don't get through, we'll continue on for next week. As always, if anybody has a comment, they can put it in the comment box. I tend to see them relatively soon. Sometimes I miss them. Of course, make sure they're comments about what we're talking about, so I can respond. But just let me give a quick recap of last week and generally where we are. We've been discussing icons and the iconographic orientation to reality that opens up our hearts to God and perceiving reality more deeply and let's say accurately. There's a statement. We're celebrating the Seventh Ecumenical Council today. One of the statements that came out of that council is icons do with color what scriptures do with words. So these are things that can, part of our holy tradition that help us in that transformational journey to become Christ-like. So, hey, Vasily. So we're going to have people coming in and out, by the way, and we encourage that here. We want everybody to feel free to come and go as they please, free will. So last week we spoke fairly in depth about the symbolism and depth of veils, right? What they mean, the veils that cover our spiritual eyes and our hearts that keep us from perceiving clearly, and really how our spiritual growth in this life is slowly removing the veil little by little so that we can see as best we can. Probably never going to remove it completely on this side of the grave. We spoke about how veils, curtains, you'll see that in the English translation of scriptures, you'll see the word veil or curtain pretty much means the same thing. How they were used in the tabernacle structure and the tents, and that how the Holy Fathers, and I quoted a few, saw the veils as symbolism of Christ's flesh, so that when the veil was torn, the curtain was torn between the holy and the holy of holies. When Christ died on the cross, the barrier was being removed. So now we all, and the Holy Spirit was to come, and we all have equal access to God based on our choosing. So in our liturgical life, and I'm quoting author Andrew Williams, whose book I read this summer, which I thought was a really good book, all about the iconographic orientation. He reminded us that our liturgy is a life of veils, and veils are another way to speak of the simultaneous now and not yet nature of this life, in which everything we experience in our present moment has eternal significance that is yet to be fully revealed. I think understanding this dynamic of the now and not yet is really, really important for our overall Christian understanding of everything, right? So Christ defeated evil, but evil is not yet destroyed. We live in the era where Christ is ruling amidst his enemies, and slowly, we're seeing much change. I mean, if you really look at things from a global perspective over time, so many things have been so much better since the advent of the church, of the spreading of Christianity. There's still pockets of evil, pockets of atrocities. Even as we speak, things are going on right now. But we can see this. It's hard depending on the head. The head thinks where the feet stand. So it just depends on where you are in life and what's going on, what news source you may use, whatever. But we see this. The world is a better place because of Christianity and the church, even though we all still have our warts to overcome, and there's things we're doing. So this whole now, not yet is important. So we're on a journey to recovering our humanity, to be fully human, as Christ demonstrated with his divine and human nature. Come on in.
Yeah, maybe I'll sneak around.
I'm just going to keep blathering on.
Room for some other people.
So keep going. So on this journey we have to remove the veils, there's lots of distractions. We were talking about some things before this class began live. The parable of the sower, it's wonder. I didn't realize that was going to be Sunday's gospel when I put that together, but that's a great illustration. So many of us receive initially the faith with joy, but then distractions, myriad distractions take us away. So today, I've done my little soliloquy, if you will, my little lecture. Today, we're going to focus on the specifics of what can potentially turn these veils that we have over our eyes and our face into hardened masks. So I'll throw out what I think is a softball question, but I don't mean to put anybody on the spot. They don't know the answer. I'm not trying to. So what are the things that what is the thing that causes the veil over our eyes to harden over time into a mask? What's the root cause of that? Maybe it's a curveball.
The loss of the notion of agape and love.
Yeah, but what's at the root cause of that? What causes us to lose?
Fear.
Sin. What I'm getting at, sin is the root cause of all the bad stuff in our, that leads us to, you brought up fear. That's a good one. We'll get into that a little bit. Fear, the need to control, hate, all this other stuff. And so just to illustrate where people are, where all of us are, do you remember in the Gospel of John, when the voice from heaven spoke, the Father spoke? Do you remember the language John uses to describe the reaction of people?
Some of them heard him, and some of them just heard some kind of like noise.
Good morning, Susan. Yeah, they heard. So some heard a voice but thought it was an angel.
Yeah.
Some just heard thunder.
Yes.
Only the apostles knew it was the voice of the Father. So that's a good illustration of where all of us can be, right, at any given time. I think we've all had the experience where we feel in our hearts, we have that kind of noetic revelatory moment where we feel like we just know something, or we felt like we've had a connection, right? And then other times, I'm sure we sit here, go through liturgy, and our minds are all over the place. What am I doing here? I don't even know what that kind of thing. We all have different experience. So the more we commit, Vasily, we're talking about the commitment, the more we commit to the sacramental life of the church, the more we shed this virus of sin, and hopefully the veil starts to slowly, dissipate. And so the more we become sanctified. But there's one particular type of sin that I want to get into that's very germane to what we're talking about, that really dims our spiritual vision, if you will, our spiritual perception. It's kind of, let me just think. I mean, again, there's not necessarily a wrong answer. I'm looking for a particular thing, but there could be other things you guys bring up that I haven't considered. But I'm thinking of this one type of sin that really gets us. And I'll give you a hint for those of you that know the scriptures fairly well. The first epistle of John, not the Gospel of John, John 5:21. He ends with a little phrase that seems at first to be not in keeping with the rest of his epistle, but he brings up this particular sin.
Vanity? Was vanity?
Yeah, that's touching upon it. Yeah, that's definitely in the realm of what I'm talking about. Elizabeth is going to her source.
It's envy.
Envy?
No.
Well, kind. I mean,
Bible with who?
he says, little children, keep yourself from idols. So it's little children, keep yourselves from idols. Is anybody familiar with this epistle? It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. I love anything John did. So he writes about the themes of his epistle are, be in the world but not of the world. Loving God and loving others. Talked about fear and how perfect love casts out fear, because fear leads to a need to control, and when you're control, well, I'll talk more about that later. But that's a big obstacle in our growth is fear and control. But he ends with that, and when you think about it, it really is in keeping with the rest of what he wrote about, because it's idols, the things we make idols that get in our way of our growth. And I would submit, again, this is challengeable, that the history of the church, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the big battle was one of idolatry. Agree, disagree? It's And so in John 5:21, when he says, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols," you can connect those to the Ten Commandments, especially the first two. Remember?
Michael, what's the context for that line? What comes before that? Like, why does he utter, or why does he write the
Because
phrase, "Little children"?
his whole epistle is all about being in the world but not of the world, and then how the things we need to do to love God and love others, to be free from sin. And so he ends with that because it's the idolatry that are the main things that keep us from those objectives, right? It's the things we fall into that we make of such importance worldly wise that keep us from our spiritual growth. And we'll get into this more. And it's not always, I tend, you tend, I'm sure we do. We hear words, we're kind of reductionists by nature. So we tend to hear something and don't think about it in a broader context of what it's meant. We hear idols. I mean, my first thing I think of is like a statue, something being worshipped other than God. But I mean, idols can mean a lot of different things. And Paul actually wrote about a lot of these things in his epistles, although he didn't necessarily use the word idol. Does that help?
Yes, no, I didn't know if there was something specific to that line, but I'm just trying to think about when you're referencing here idolatry. Are we talking then essentially about venerating or worshiping anything but God? Whether it's material things, whether it's other concepts, whether it's our own egotistical ambitions, these are all encompassing under idolatry.
Pretty much. The scripture that I wrote down to kind of explain. So Paul in Colossians 3 verse 5, he said, "Put to death your members which are on the earth: fornication, uncleanliness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." So he's lumping all these passions that become idols. So, God gave us these natural, normal desires, right? They became corrupted due to sin. So the passions are desires directed the wrong way. Okay. And so he's making a broader case that, the idolatry is basically elevating wrong desires that then lead us to worship or venerate the wrong things. And, we see that. I mean, look at the world. Look at, we talked about this, I think we did a couple of weeks. The words icons and idols are thrown away very casually, but who do we make icons and idols today? A lot, in our society. It's usually one of sports or worldly achievement for in and of its own sake.
Well, we've stripped the words of their essential meaning.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. So once you've done that, you can apply it to celebrities or whatnot, because it doesn't mean what it used to anymore.
Yeah, and also like I would say some I don't know much about celebrities, but a lot of them aspire to do something and then they become celebrity, or celebrity is thrust upon them, whether they want it or not. But that happens because culturally there's this wrong value put on being a celebrity, or distorted value, right? That's what I would argue, at least.
Well, we use the term idolize, right? We idolize a figure or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean, take an example. I'm just thinking of Madonna, and this is a person that people should emulate, but she's an icon, right? Was
Icon of what?
So along those lines, then technically, the word idolize, the verb, to your point, George, really shouldn't be applied anywhere except. I mean, do we even say idolize God? We don't.
No,
right?
no,
So
that almost
No.
seems
So
No.
to idolize is to automatically be doing something that is unholy or misdirected, right?
misdirected.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? Because once you're idolizing anything or any person, otherwise, you're already in the wrong direction. I mean, again, stripping these words of their original meaning.
Yeah, and there's a fine line between admiring
Yeah.
someone's achievement or someone, right? But then between that or starting to almost fall into, worship of that person, or an aspiration in your heart for the wrong reasons, right? It's like I remember just seeing these things on social media. I don't know how true they are, but it kind of struck me as true, where I would read things where you would ask young people today, what's their ambition? A lot of them would say to be famous, as opposed to achieve something even, right? So it's like, where's all this going? And I think my guess is social media has exacerbated that, because let's face it, a lot of us, well, I've said this before, and I've used this in settings, and everybody usually cops to it when I bring it up. But if I said, who in this room suffers from imposter syndrome? Right? My hands up, right? So we all, no matter what we do, we all have an inherent insecurity or whatever. And sometimes, depending on how big that is or how mature you are, it's easy to get seduced into likes and fame and all of that
Yeah.
because it's intoxicating or whatnot. But it's all in this realm of idolization, right? It's not a good
Well,
thing.
you know, that really struck me when you said that, you know, they want to be famous. The thought that comes to me is that it boils down to self-worth, right? I
Mhm.
mean, if you have a strong family and you're there and you're raised right, you know, you grow up with a sense of self-worth in you, right? Just inherent that your family and your friend, you know, it all happens. But if you've reached a point in time where being famous is what's going to, I don't know, validate you.
Yeah, and
that's
again,
kind of
this
off the path.
what strikes me, and I want to be careful because this is how I connect the dots. And I think when we look at our faith, right, we go back to God's nature, the Holy Trinity, communal in nature, and you talk about where do we derive our self-worth from? Well, worth of self comes from God, who created us in His image and likeness. So the more we're in union with God, the irony is that the more we die to self, we gain self. But that understanding is not really understood all that well. So we try to gain self through other ways. And as we lose communal structures and we have this focus on individualism, even that famous scripture, I can do all things through God who strengthens me. Look that up and look at the memes. It's usually a lone person high on a mountain. They're doing something, but they're always alone. It's never like, it's never like I can do all things through God who strengthens me. And I'm sitting around a table with other people that are strengthening me. It's never that. And so that individual stuff can kind of lead to, and all the messages today about self. So to me, it's so distorted because it's backwards. It's all about like be yourself. Like it's validating self through self. Our validation comes from loving God. The vertical cross and loving others. Right. It's that, and that makes sense. Am I making?
It's like the ego.
Mhm.
I mean, the ego is kind of the root of all sin.
Yeah.
The I, the inward direction at yourself, not God in yourself. The hubris, the pride, and the ego.
Yeah.
And
Because
these people that want to be famous, they want to be validated as their self rather than, as you said, for what they've done or good they've brought.
yeah, or just letting any fame be an outgrowth of the good you do, and then of course you have to always, if you're one of those people, you have to manage that. Like I was actually I won't mention his name because I don't know if he would want to be in this context, but I was at a function recently with a friend of mine who's a priest who's become very popular due to the great work he's been doing. And I was sitting there with him, and we were just talking, and some guy came up to him and clearly wanted to talk to him. So I got quiet and let him have his talk. And he said, "So what's it like? How do you feel about being famous?" And his reaction is, "I'm not famous. I may be known in this small pocket of people, but I'm not famous." He almost recoiled from it, which I was like, and I knew his heart, so I knew that would be his reaction. But that's even in this, we're in this Orthodox Christian conference, and someone is like, Google it over fame. It's like, wow, this goes deep, and I suspect we all have some degree of this or whatever, because even those of us in business, our business grows by our name recognition growing or our demand growing, right? So it's, I don't know.
I like the way John phrased that. Little children. And in the modern world, I think, we don't have a problem with worshiping statues so much, but we are besieged by materialism, even if we think we're not.
Right.
And idolatry often takes the form of being just like a little child with a new toy. Like you get a new car and you can't stay out of it. You can't stop looking at it. You can't stop driving it. And for me, recently I bought a new rifle. I love to target shoot. And oh man, I cleaned it And then I had to very carefully carve my initials in the heel of the stock and, you know, all this stuff. That I got a sling for it. And yet I changed the sights, and I was paying way too much attention to this thing. You know, I could have been reading the Bible instead of doing this stuff.
Volunteering in Appalachia, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, I just like a kid, a dumb kid with a new toy. But that is a bit of idolatry, because I was elevating this rifle to a position of greater importance than it should have had.
Yeah, anything that can, anything that
Anything like that.
anything that becomes a distraction of the good we could or should be doing at that moment can fall into that. I want to get back to something. I actually want to zone in on something you both said, Elizabeth and Bob. You know, you brought up ego. Well, that's, you know, that goes back to the garden, right? The choice of self over, and then the progression of that, right? Because remember the progression. Adam and Eve chose self over God, and then they ended up begetting a murderer, and then that murderer found, you know, his sin was worse, couldn't get food from the ground. So what's he do? He found cities, implements technology, tries to control, whoever said control there, starting to control, make things subject to him. And then, of course, that leads, get the Tower of Babel. The next step, we're going to pull down God. We're going to control God. So that's why I said control. Well, I know we've talked about this in years past, but to me, fear and control are among the two of the biggest blocks to our spiritual growth.
Fear is how they get control.
And we
I
buy
think we all
into
saw this to some extent with a pandemic. And I kind of fear that the government has discovered how they can put a ring in everybody's nose, make us afraid of something, and put themselves up as the only cure for it.
Yeah, I mean, control. The thing about control that I always find so ironic when you really think about it is, if you ever notice, controlling people tend to be controlled by that which they're trying to control, the desire to control, right? So you become controlled by it. That's why it's sometimes really hard to understand a God who, you know, oh, I let these bad things happen, but it's so antithetical to love and freedom, right? Even free to choose wrongly. It's so opposite of that nature. But you know, there's a lot of that, and so. But then getting back to, you know, this whole, good morning. Sorry. No, it's fine. I said what John was speaking about. Think about the first two commandments. Anybody remember them? I always have to go back. I never get them in order, right? So I always got to go back and look. If anybody feels bad, I can't rattle them off so easy either. So,
What was the question?
what are the first two commandments of the 10 Commandments? I'm tying it back to what John said about idolatry.
Thou shalt have no other gods.
Yeah.
But he, and what's the other one? Wow, why are we so bad at this?
First one.
Thou shalt have no other.
God's before me.
Isn't he idolized?
Have no other
Isn't he
gods
idol?
before.
Thou shalt have no other. Thou shalt not worship false idols.
You should not make for yourself a carved image,
A carved
any
image.
likeness of it. Yeah.
But
So,
Brad, can
yeah.
I just ask you though,
Yeah.
before you proceed?
Yeah.
Are we certain that is the correctly translated phrase? Because we get into this whole issue of Old Testament translation. I mean, whose translation is it that it's a carved symbol?
I'm
Carved
using
image?
the Greek translation from the
Okay.
Orthodox Study Bible. When I looked at all kinds of other translations, I'm fairly confident
All
that,
right.
The Septuagint, okay.
Okay.
well, it doesn't mean it's
No.
right all the time. There's a yeah, if you listen to like Father Stephen DeYoung or Dr. Genie, you know, you understand that there really isn't a canonical Orthodox Old Testament. And you can't always, and the Septuagint actually properly refers to the first 5 books of the Bible.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it's not.
Because I thought anything that was translated into Greek was it.
No,
That's
no.
what we take.
I'm a lay student of the Bible, so I know a little something, but you get into serious biblical stuff, you realize, man, it's not always what we think it is. But so, and then the other thing is that sometimes, occasionally, the Greek translation will take you further away from the true meaning, and you have to go back to the Hebrew. So it just depends. But
The reason I
Yeah.
ask is because we make a big issue of translation for all the right reasons, right? You want to have as accurate a translation or understanding of the original scripture
Yeah.
as possible. But the first thing that comes to mind is, not just what happened with the Jewish people who created literally false carved idols, right? Right there at the foot of Mount Sinai,
Mhm.
but also our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church. Do they have an understanding of that commandment as carved image? I mean, we don't really have statues per se in the Orthodox Church. We have iconography, going back to the topic at hand here, but
I think they do, but I don't. It doesn't necessarily boil down to whether it's a statue per se or what the car. Let me break it down a little
okay.
bit.
I don't mean to digress.
No,
here,
no, you're
but
not
it's just-
digressing at all. Let me break it down.
Oh,
But
heard
The
that.
image is
Yeah.
just something that reminds you or draws your mind
Mhm.
to the person depicted, and you're not worshiping the statue, then it's no different than us venerating an icon.
Yeah, like the seventh
I have
commandment.
run into
Yeah.
evangelicals who accuse us of being idol worshipers because we venerate icons, and try to explain to some of these folks the difference between veneration and worship.
Yes.
With all due res-
reaction you get is
Yeah.
something like,
with all due respect to them, though, what the way their church has evolved and what they've been taught, I can see why they think that because they haven't been exposed. So so
Okay.
let me try to break it down, and then please feel free to interrupt. Bring me back to this if it's not addressed. No, but I want to, like you brought up Sinai. You talk about the golden calf.
Yep.
I want to bring up something there, and so I'm going to be careful how I phrase it because it can go really dark. But that story is taught in a very benign way. You know, they made a golden calf and were worshiping it. What was going on there? Think that Moses is up on the mountain, right? He's up on the mountain with God face to face. This is extremely holy what's going on. So what are his people doing? They're trying to control God. They by creating this calf, they're trying to control God. And if you read the account closely, Aaron is kind of caught in the middle. So he's trying to bend it to worship Yahweh, right? But they don't really care. So he's trying to like not mess up commandment number 1. They're all over the map. They don't care. They're trying. They're willing to worship any God. Any God's going to deliver them their problem. But the language that's just to put this in the context, and I won't go too far because I want to keep us focused on the beautiful, not the decadent. But they rose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offering, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and then rose up to play.
Oh, let's play.
Okay. All right.
This was pagan revelry.
Right, yeah.
Okay, this was violence. This was all kinds of stuff. So what I'm saying is this idolatry led to this is God's people, God's chosen people. He's chosen them, led to complete decadence, and this is why Moses' reaction was so violent when he first broke the commandments, because it was the epitome of sacrilege, if you will, or whatever. So John saying, little children, keep yourself from idols. This idolatry has always led God's people astray, big time. And this is what's going on. Now, obviously, when you teach Sunday school or even here, you don't want to get too far into things, but just to know that's what's going on. So, tying it back, you said something, or someone said something that made me think, we don't worship statues today or whatever. But we also, because we're such a secular, literalistic society, we've kind of forgotten, what does idol really mean? So Paul, John says, keep yourself from idols. And, Paul and Colossians kind of defined idols. But I would say Paul reminds us of a couple other truths too that we can't forget. I'm going to find my notes here because I want to quote the scripture correctly. But he reminds us of what actually, how do idols take root in our hearts? We have to remember, this is what Paul says, Ephesians 6:12. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We're not necessarily wrestling with a carved image per se, right? We're wrestling with what's behind it. Against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. So this is a spiritual warfare that's going on. And then Paul says in Colossians 2:15 about Christ, having disarmed these principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them. So the whole point of idolatry is it all gets back to spiritual warfare. Okay, spiritual warfare. And then in terms of the actual images themselves, what's really being, what's misunderstood there, and I'm just going to read a note from the Orthodox Study Bible because I think it encapsulates it pretty good. An idol or image depicts some God as having a form or shape, but the true God has no form or shape, right? God the Father has no form or shape. Wherefore did Israel use image? Why therefore did Israel use images in their worship? Because all of these foreshadow the incarnation of the Son of God, whom we worship both as God and man. Also, icons used in church worship do not depict the divine nature. They draw attention to the incarnation. So notice icons are always they're usually about a biblical event or something in Christ's life, right? It all flows from the incarnation that was always intended by God. The incarnation wasn't a backup plan because of sin, right? God always intent was always to come and dwell among us. That's how in Orthodox faith we understand it. So it's not whether it's a statue or an icon, it's not the image itself. It's what's behind the image or how we regard the image or how we even create the image. That's what's important. So, John, you're smiling. I sent the challenge coming, which is good.
There's no challenge.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
no challenge. I never challenge.
Okay.
I just discuss.
Discuss.
But at the risk of being the iconoclast here,
Mhm.
I also try to understand with the very, very limited scriptural exposure that I've given myself, Michael, admittedly, that these gospel passages and the books of the gospel were all written during the Roman Empire, and Christians were persecuted for not worshiping Roman gods, Roman statues, right? What would the Romans say? Just light this incense over here. Keep worshiping your Christ, but worship this Roman god, worship Augustus. And they wouldn't do it. And they were tortured and killed, right?
Right. Yep.
Martyred. So is there any context for this when we talk about little children do not idolize or however the phrasing goes? Is there a Roman Empire context of this that's historical as well? Because when these letters are being written, this is what they're contending with.
Yes, and I think I can connect the dots. But again, let's have a discussion if I'm not. So to your point, in a broader sense, yes, these scriptures were written in an idolatrous culture,
Right.
as you mentioned. But it also they're written with Paul and John and Peter with a deep understanding of what has always gone on
In Judaism.
in Judaism,
yeah.
right? So let me try to explain this, and again, I made a lot of notes because I want to make sure that I'm communicating clearly, and my mind goes all over the map, so I got to
And I
structure.
don't mean to go all over the
No,
map
this
either,
is fine.
You're just bringing us a very interesting.
I don't mind going all over the map, but I'm sensitive to the fact that the way I work naturally is I'm all over the place. So I really try to structure myself so that I don't lose the audience I'm speaking to. So going back to Genesis, right, in the creation story, recognize that in the ancient Near East, in that time, what Genesis was really doing, it was Genesis. The creation story in Genesis was a complete inversion of what was understood in those cultures at the time. What I mean by that, and we talked about Moses and the golden calf, there was a belief that you prayed to God, you prayed to your gods because you wanted an outcome, a result. God needs to be on my side to win this war, whatever. So they believed that those cultures would create an image of God, whether it's a statue, whatever it may be. They would create an image of God, and then they would create the image as such, where they would open the nose and the mouth of the God, because that was the way of they believe would capture the God in that object in a way of controlling God, right? That's what they thought. So with Genesis, what do you have? You have God breathing in his image to man, the opposite. Okay, complete inversion. So what I just explained, you can trace that type of belief throughout culture. I mean, we even have it today. We're obsessed with technology. We're going to control outcomes, right? Anything that fails, we look at it as a failure of an outcome that we should have achieved, right? So we're always trying to bend things to a certain outcome. So, I mean, maybe that may be a bit of a stretch in some respects, but that nature to control things is still with us. And I would say that because maybe not in this room or listening online, but most of us don't really, even we don't always understand that the warfare we're fighting is a spiritual warfare, right? We look at the perpetrator of evil and want to kill that evil. You understand that you want to stop this evil from occurring, but loving your enemies means understanding what's behind. It's that evil being perpetuated, being driven by something else behind it, something spiritually, right? So the person that's committing those evils, yes, that person may need to be stopped. Sadly, that person may even need to be killed in certain situations to save people. But always understand that what's going on is deeper. That's why in our Orthodox Church, even if someone kills somebody in self-defense, somebody's coming into your home to kill your family, and you kill that person, they don't allow you to receive communion for a while, not because they're punishing you, because they don't want your heart to harden. It's very easy to harden. They tried to kill my family, I killed them, right? There's still regret over death, over the evil of that situation, right? So it's to keep our hearts from becoming hardened, from our mass to harden. So I would say that this type of understanding you could extrapolate to modern culture and point, but that's really what's going on. So they're in this idolatrous culture that still believed, like, number one, there's more than just the one God, right? I mean, the Old Testament uses gods in the plural quite a bit, but usually they mean demons, fallen angels, Pharaoh. In the Old Testament, it was always understood that it was a spiritual defeat of the gods of Egypt, which included Pharaoh and all the demons behind Pharaoh. So there's a spiritual warfare. So that's what it is. It's that type of idolatry. And in today's world, where we've largely, we have that dichotomy I've talked about of sacred or secular culture, and secular thinking tends to dominate the dialogue. Spiritual warfare is considered for the unsophisticated, the unenlightened that believe this kind of thing. So
So going back to the statues and
Mhm.
stuff, I understand at least that the church fathers considered the Greek gods actually to be representative of certain demons.
yes,
Right.
yes.
So even though they may take a beautiful form, and we see them in our museums and visiting Greece all the time, and actually they form our houses.
Mhm.
The other part about that is kind of confounding, though. Understanding evil is we mentioned about how there's evil forces and there's
Mhm.
spiritual warfare. Yet it's obvious, right? But so many people don't even think that there's such a thing. There's only good angels, but devil, demons, trying to harm us or tempt us or whatever.
What happened in Israel was demonic.
Any type of evil like that,
Yeah.
taking life of child, all that stuff's demonic in its nature. But if you read, can't think of a direct quote, but I remember when I read like the Philokalia, and I read a lot of the Holy Fathers about. I read this book. I can't remember the title now. It was all about mental illness and treatment, all this stuff. The Holy Fathers. You realize, yes, they didn't necessarily have the science and technology of our day, but their in-depth understanding of integrated reality, spiritual and material, body, mind, and soul. I sometimes, sounds arrogant, but I do sometimes laugh when I hear some of the practices going on now about holistic healing or whatever. It's like, well, we're just relearning what we forgot, in terms of how everything used to be integrated. I mean, Luke was a doctor, right? Right. He did the science of his day in understanding the spiritual reality. There's no separation. There would be it wouldn't be like this and that too. It was all this together, right? That kind of thing. So I would say, yeah, because that's been a picture that's been painted. But even if you sat down and read a little bit of the Bible, you'd say, well, okay. I mean, Christ himself said Satan caused this. Well, he didn't get it. He didn't understand. There's no devil. Talk about veils turning into masks. We easily believe what we want to believe as human beings, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's the fake Christianity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you have to really, I might have mentioned before, like a lot of my early influence because of my grandmother and whatnot was Christian Science. Have anybody ever heard of that? Which,
well, the reading rooms, yes.
right. But one of the good thing it did for me is it tuned me into spiritual reality. What I had to not unlearn because I never bought into it but it's very Gnostic. Like material reality was almost illusionary, right? So so it'd be easy to kind of. I would listen to some of my family members talk, and they would talk in that context, but I wasn't computing with me. But the point was, I kind of had to unlearn that influence to start to, because they would say that same way too. There's no such thing as a devil, Oh yeah, it's error. I mean, you study some religion, especially, they have Christian in the title. They're not necessarily traditional Christian. We get some wild stuff. It doesn't really, so everybody has to kind of maybe unlearn some things to just see clearly. Go ahead.
I have a question, and maybe I didn't understand what you're saying.
Right.
I'm stuck on when you said that Christ coming incarnate wasn't plan B. So if man had not fallen, Christ would have still come in the flesh.
Yeah, I think again, check my memory. Saint Gregory the theologian. Trying to think of some others that yes. So it was always God's intent to dwell among His people, like we see in the Book of Revelation, right? And so when we're made in His image and likeness, that's somewhat to be understood too of His incarnational image and likeness. And so He was always in the plan for God to commune with His people. That's how it's. So when sin came along, things changed a little bit. That God then, took on a redemptive mission in addition to restore communion. So, John, you're frowning. I don't know.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
I thought it was a result of original sin.
No, but see, that's actually one of the things misunderstood that gets into this belief of the body and materiality are just a shell, right? But again, if you read Revelation, again, you can look at that and say, well, that's all symbolic. But no, it's clear. You read, chapter 21 and chapter 22, the new heaven, the new earth. It's restored. It's restored, and it's always incarnational. I feel like I'm losing the room on that one.
Behold, He makes all things new.
Behold, I make all things new. That's a good scripture to hang on to whenever we're going through our own personal hell. That God's making things new within that. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I might be way off on this, but
So might I.
sin was already, God created paradise, right? And everything was perfect, but yet Satan already existed. So sin was already there. Satan is sin, right? Or is Satan a power that causes us to separate from God and become sinful?
Both.
So sin already existed even in paradise?
Yeah, this is where it gets a little bit heady.
Especially in the potential.
Yeah, that's what I'm
It's
thinking.
really the potential.
Satan is given power to do bad, but the action of sin is us, not Satan. It's our allowing Satan to be activated.
Yes. So if I understand what you're saying, so God created everything, angels and people, with freedom.
And it was perfect,
Right.
Paradise.
Free will, freedom. So there's always the potential,
Yeah.
right? And so the way I understand this is that the way a lot of going back to how the New Testament was written, all of this was in the context of what was understood in what's called Second Temple Judaism. Again, those of you familiar with Father Stephen DeYoung or Dr. Jeannie Constantino, some biblical scholars, go read their stuff. They'll explain it better than
Very
I.
different from modern Judaism.
Yes.
Which we don't understand.
Right.
Yep.
Modern Judaism is really a result of what happened in the 4th and 5th century after Christianity. So that's a whole nother subject. So within that context, for example, again, reductionist. A lot of times the Garden of Eden story is reduced to, talking animal, right? But the word used for serpent is the same word, derives from the same word that also is used for seraphim, like angel, right? So
That's interesting.
yeah,
Fallen
so
angel.
yeah, well, it's just angel. So, and because in the Second Temple Judaic understanding, Eden was God's place on earth, where the angels and these human beings were. So Adam and Eve interacting with angelic beings in the garden would have been okay, makes total sense. We reduce it to a talking snake, right? That's the modern Sunday school story. And so when the devil later on, this is, I think I've taught this before. I can't remember. Later on, when the devil is tempting Christ in the wilderness, he says, all authority has been given to me. It goes back to the garden where he basically tricked Adam and Eve to giving him the authority by their actions. So it all connects. But yeah, so there wasn't, Christ said he's a murderer from the beginning. When he lies, he speaks his native tongue, because he immediately chose to exercise his free will to go against God. And then of course he wanted to destroy, God's creation. And so he tempts man and woman, and it all connects that way. But so there's always, within freedom, there's always the potential to choose wrongly, is really what best way I can put it. Does that hang together? Okay.
One thing I think is really interesting about that story is, actually, I got this out of a, believe it or not, a Jewish study Bible, but they have a little bit different take on this. They believe that what God breathed into Adam's nostrils was a God-aware soul. And the name of that breath of life, which gave him the ability to conceive with and communicate with God, was a neshama. They believe that every animal has a soul, but that's a nephesh, which is sort of a self-aware soul only. But then later on, trouble starts up. I mean, it's funny. God creates this perfect order, and by page 2 or 3, we're already screwing up. But anyway, Cain slays Abel. And God goes to Cain and he says, they have this discourse, and Cain is banished. And Cain says, I can't go out there. Those other people will kill me. Other people? Well, so far we've only heard of Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. But there's other people out there. And then in 6:2, there's that famous thing, there was giants in the earth, mighty men of renown, and that's really open to a lot of interpretations. Some people think they were fallen angels. But at any rate, he puts a mark on Cain so that they won't kill him. And then later on in Revelation, there's a mark of a beast. So Cain is going out into this totally evil setting with a mark that spares him. Kind of interesting. But it's just sort of a different take on things. It's something that I've always been puzzled about. Apparently, I think we've all had the experience of, you try to explain faith to somebody and you might as well talk to the wall. They just can't get it. And if you're Jewish, you say, well, some people have inherited the neshama that was given to Adam, and then there's a bunch of other people who have a nephesh. And they can't conceive of God no matter what. Just sort of an interesting thing.
Yeah,
It's a whole nother class.
that is. I would say invest some time. You want a lot of giants. Invest your time with the pod fathers, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung on Lord of Spirits. They really get into this stuff in depth. Another book by the late Michael Heiser, Protestant Christian, wonderful guy though, and he writes his book like a page turner. Gets into everything you just said, and he explains it really well. We're getting right at time, so we're going to end in a moment. I would say a couple of things. One, you really can't explain faith. You can't explain faith.
No,
And
you can't.
so, if you ever get into those discussions, you really have to zip your mouth, use your ears, and really listen to what that person's saying so you can respond within your knowledge base, which is really hard. And a lot of times that would be, I don't know. Right. But faith is taught, it's caught, not taught. So a lot of times what moves people to faith is the experience of you when they're with us, right? Because we are the gospel to that person in that moment if they're seeking. and we can mess it up in a hurry if we try to drop into this pedagogical model. Just learn this stuff and you'll have faith. Doesn't work that way. So I think we'll end here. We didn't cover everything. I didn't expect we would. I still haven't got into what I've been not trying to, but what I've planned for the last couple of weeks, getting into the whole mask thing. And then what I asked you about last week, John, to explain to me how to pronounce the word for hypocrisy. We'll get there.
Stop associating me with hypocrisy publicly, okay?
I'm not.
I've asked you already. Stop
No.
saying John hypocrite. John hypocrite.
I don't know what you're hearing, John. I asked you about how to pronounce the word, not because you're an expert at being a hypocrite. John is not a hypocrite, as far as I know. So people out there, yeah. Well, you know what? Next week, that's what's bothering you. So next week we're going to get into that, and we'll all probably walk away feeling uncomfortable. Really, I'm a hypocrite, but thank God for Christ, right? Because Christ is there to to offer us grace in our weakness and hypocrisy. So Elaine, I saw your comment about, I've always known evil is the absence of God. Absolutely. And we have free will to include God in our lives, but there are people that have embraced the absence of God, and by that embracing have let other things into their life. That's why Christ talked about the house. Remember in Luke, where he talked about someone's house is swept and put in order, but then the demon comes back with 7 more, because when that house was put in order, it was never filled with the right thing. So that absence was never filled with the right presence. So anyway, I just wanted to address that quickly, but thank you all for those in the room and who joined online. We're going to end now. We'll be back next week, the 22nd of October. I don't think there's anything prohibitive going on in the church that's going to get in the way of that. So everybody have a wonderful week. God bless you, and we'll see you.